I would like to introduce three very knowledgeable speakers to start this discussion. We have Ranjan Mohnot, our country representative from Bangladesh, that was just mentioned by Ulrika. Welcome. Victor Galaz, you're associate professor at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and I'm looking for Anna Willman. Welcome. Great to see you here. Yes. Welcome. Can you help me set the global picture, just to make sure that we all are on the same page on what is happening? And I think we have a perfect example in Bangladesh. And this is a broad question, I know, Ranjan, but what is the situation in Bangladesh today as one of the countries that are being most affected? I would call it like a frontline country in the effects.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me. Let's be with me in Bangladesh 2024. This year, January, I just give you examples so you can imagine how a situation in country looks like with this climate change and disaster induced by climate change. So this January, we had cold wave. Now, Bangladesh is a coastal country or coastal area, a lot of part. There's not generally that cold, but this year there is serious cold wave. 2 million people affected. 2 million people affected. We have some gap, February, March, mostly okay, calmer. Here comes April. April and May, there were prolonged heat waves. The temperature reached 44, which is very, very unusual for Bangladesh. 30 million kids skipped the school, couldn't go to school because serious heat in Bangladesh. Many rickshaw puller, daily worker lost their job because they can't go out and work on a daily basis. That's April. Let's come to May. A big cyclone, Cyclone Rimal, hit coast of Bangladesh, affecting more than 5 million people. Many communities were submerged in water for days and weeks. Then come June, July, August. We have 3 big floods in Bangladesh in different regions. In eastern region, northern region, southern region. Prolonged rainy season, monsoon season, a lot of water. More than 10 million people affected by rain. Now these events, and this is only August, September. Now October, November, December, there may be another cyclone season, we hope. This will go quietly, but we have to prepare for that part. Now, these frequent disasters affect women, people with disabilities, marginalized community in disappropriate ways. Kids miss school, as I mentioned, and it affects their livelihood, it affects their everything. They are in a continuous cycle of repair their house, rebuild their house, and again damaged by disaster in next weeks. So situation is very, very grim. And on top of it, last year in 2023, more than 2,000 people died because of dengue. Dengue was not that common in Bangladesh, but now the season was prolonged. At one point of time, there was no beds available in hospitals so people can get treatment. So these new phenomena, these new disasters which keep coming, which keep community on the edge every time is affecting everybody. And this is example for this year, just to set a scene, but this is not isolated example. We see this increased frequency of disaster year by year, and many, many millions of people are affected.
And I think we will come back to this intersection, and I know that this is also something when we talk about the domestic level in Sweden, we will have Folkhälsomyndigheten here as well that work with public health issues in Sweden, already looking at this when we add all of these different levels. I'm turning to you now, Victor, because when you're listening to this, you're an associate professor at the Stockholm Resilience Center. How does this resonate with what we're seeing on a global level? You mentioned before when we talked this concept of polycrisis.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me. And thanks to all of you for the amazing work you're doing out in the world. The term polycrisis, I have somewhat mixed feelings about it. So polycrisis, essentially, you have multiple crises that hit that doesn't really allow you to bounce back properly. And in one sense, this is what many communities around the world have faced for a very long time. But I think the difference this time and the way we approach it as academics is that we're now seeing it as a possible global phenomena, partly because we're so connected, right? So what happens in the Amazon doesn't stay in the Amazon. What happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. What happens in a wet market in China doesn't stay in China, right? So that connectivity has put us in a state where we're actually dealing with multiple crises that interplay in complex ways all the time. So I think what we as academics try to figure out, why is this happening and how can we uncouple in a way to make sure that we are able to respond and bounce back in a good way and maybe even transform. It sounds super academic, I know, but I think it does make a difference for the way we think about adaptation. So that's another debate, like what are the limits to adaptation? Are there limits to adaptation? I don't want to take away agency from people or communities, but like how much are we actually able to cope with what we're seeing all over the world, and how do we make this stop?
So exactly my question to you then, Ranjan. You work with those communities very hands-on in adaptation and in early warning, and I think Ulrika has already mentioned a great example in Bangladesh where we worked with cyclone systems, for instance. But when you're hit by all of these crises, what do you do? What do you prepare for?
So yes, it's if I say in one sentence, you are out of options in some time. We are in a continuous response mode, and that actually decreases our ability to do something different because our mindset is always thinking about saving life. But what we do when we are not responding to disaster, there are two aspects. One is working at the community level. So we go to communities, remote communities everywhere, and organize them, build the community groups, community disaster response group, train them on disaster, train them on evacuation, train them on early warning, first aid training, equip them, give them the proper equipment so when the flood happens, they have some life-saving equipment they can do. Prepare the sites where they can go and evacuate in terms of flood, some high area, some school buildings, some mosque where people can go and evacuate. Train volunteers, train community members. All these aspects go on a day-to-day basis. So when the disaster hit, the community can at least save lives and save some sort of a livelihood. That's one part. The another part is institution. How do we work with the government? How do we work with another actor to strengthen that? So do we have a district disaster response plan? Do we have the village disaster response plan? Do people know what to do, how to do? Do know what different agencies are working? And how do they collaborate? Do simulation exercise before disaster hit, so people know their roles when the disaster strike. So all those parts do happen. And you mentioned about the cyclone, and this is the great success story of the world. A massive cyclone hit Bangladesh in 1970, and this is what an example where humanitarian action can make a lot of difference. In 1970, a massive cyclone hit Bangladesh, almost 500,000 people died. At that time, Swedish Red Cross, Swedish government invested in Bangladesh and built a program now is called CPP, Cyclone Preparedness Program. It's a flagship program of Bangladesh Red Crescent Society and the government together. We have 70,000 community volunteers in all area, and they do evacuations, they do search and rescue when the cyclone warning comes. We are fortunate enough, now technology is helping us. We could know few days in advance when cyclone is coming. And then there is a system that signal 1, signal 2, signal 3. So people know when signal 7 what to do, signal 8 what to do, what is a good time to evacuate. And then volunteers are ready to evacuate people. And I can tell in Cyclone Remal, we were able to evacuate more than 2 million people in less than 24 hours. And not only people evacuated, but in many cases, their goats, their cows also get evacuated because that's their livelihood. We can't let the animal die because of these things. But these sort of a program need continuous investment because we have volunteers. Some volunteers may drop out. You may to recruit new. You need to train them constantly. You need to equip them constantly. It's not a one-time event. It's a regular intervention. Every year you have to ready because you don't know when the next cyclone is coming and you need to be ready for that. So these are two aspects you could do in terms of preparedness.
And Anna, I'm soon going to let you address the global policy level as well. But then I want to bring it back to you again then, Victor, because very hands-on community level, but what is academia seeing on a global level linked to this? Because when we talked a bit beforehand, you said we have a lot of early warning systems that are focused on one crisis. So this is cyclone, but you just said that you're meeting this polycrisis. So what are we looking at globally? What do we know about the coming catastrophes and building this on a global level? You're welcome for the question.
That's a dark question, but I mean, surely these kind of early warning systems that are applied to one specific type of event in one specific geography need government support. I mean, right? I mean, you need the legal support, you need economic support, and you can upscale it, surely. The challenges that we're seeing is, first of all, there's so many early warnings already for big systems, like the Amazon. Like there've been early warnings of the tip of the Amazon for a decade now. By now, we're not really seeing that forceful action that we would need to do it. The other challenge is that, yes, build early warning systems, but crises around the corner tend to evolve in different ways than we expect. So in the early 2000s, everyone was worried about avian influenza coming from Asia. You set up early warning systems in Asia, everyone waiting for that. What happens? Swine flu in the border of Mexico and the US, and then a coronavirus in China, right? So it sort of like moves in a different way. And that in the end is an argument to build what we call general resilience. Build capacities to deal with many different types of events without knowing exactly what that will be. So, for example, investment in health systems. Build strong health systems because they will help communities deal with many different things, whether it's floods or heat or something else. That's kind of like the message that we see need to come stronger. You can prepare, but the things you can't prepare for will happen. Think about general resilience.
So I will ask you, general resilience, and where are we on a policy level when it comes to then mustering that type of support or international development aid funding going into general resilience, if that's what we're facing? Anna Willman, you're a climate policy expert at Tankesmedjan.
Yeah, think tank.
Think tank, thank you for this. I warned you for the Swinglish.
Well, like we talked about before, so the main challenge for countries lies in transforming their economies to be both fossil-free and resilient to climate change and extreme weather events. And of course, for developing countries, this is obviously more challenging as it requires massive investments and access to new technologies that both allow them to break away from their fossil fuel dependency, but also to adapt their society to a warmer climate. But at the same time, many of the world's most poorest and most vulnerable countries are struggling with stretched budgets, with high debt levels, and a global private sector that's somewhat hesitant to invest in developing economies. So this is why the financing of climate action is such a critical issue. How much funding is needed, who should provide it, how should it be allocated, and that is why this year's COP summit will focus heavily on. And countries are expected to agree on a new global climate finance goal. But as with many issues, there is a divide between rich and developed and developing nations on this topic, and this divide, I think, has been even more complicated by the fact that many developed countries are now cutting their foreign aid budgets, which is where much of the climate finance comes from. And this could also potentially make it harder for countries to agree on a financing goal. Yeah.
What would be, and I'm looking perhaps mainly on you and Victor, what would be your advice to humanitarian organizations such as ourselves in this climate? Because what you're saying is we need more support for general resilience. We're seeing more and more complex crises. We want to work more with preparedness, and then you're at the same time saying that this is perhaps limits to financing. This is also what Ulrika addressed in her welcoming speech. What do we do then? Any solutions?
I can throw a couple of things in. I think, so first of all, and hopefully this doesn't feel too far away from what you think already, is that help keep the 1.5 degree target alive. I think that there is a limited capacity of how much societies can cope with what we're seeing. We're seeing high impacts from climate change already now, and we're moving very quickly towards 2 and 3, right? So please, help us keep that thing alive. Mobilizing capital, as you mentioned, is a huge topic, and that needs to be done. I think to be even more specific, I think multilateral development banks have done good work, but need to do more work. So we're talking about the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, more funding for climate adaptation, especially vulnerable communities. That to me is key. And if you want to go find more money, you need to address the harmful subsidies for activities that are polluting the climate and undermining nature services. So I think it's around $2 trillion depending on whose numbers you use. So, I mean, 1.5 degree and move the big money and get that money to people who need it to build resilience.
Do you want to comment,
Yes,
Ranjan?
I think there are few aspects in our president mentioned, like, prevention is better than cure. So we have to invest in preparedness at all level, at a community level, at a district level, at a country level. Preparedness is key. The other aspect is we need to be flexible with our approach. If we are stuck with some set of framework, and as you mentioned, like, we were preparing for avian influenza in Asia, and then something happened in Mexico. We need to be flexible because sometimes it's unpredictable, and you have to be ready to that. And the other part is investing in forecast-based financing, anticipatory actions, because the money going after disaster is not that effective. If we send money before disaster hit, if I have money or resources before a cyclone coming, before a flood coming, then I can evacuate people, I can save life, I can save livelihood, all these things. So how can we do a good model for forecast-based financing, anticipatory actions, rather than a lot of people die, and then we say, okay, let's give them resources. Other aspects which we have to keep in mind is, I told you a story about the cyclone preparedness program and millions of lives saved. But what happens is when we save life, it doesn't make headline in media. If 10,000 people die, 20,000 people die, you will see newspaper headline, you will see all the emotions coming out, and then we receive a lot of donation to help them. That's good. But if you save life, then its media story goes in a day or sometime not even appear anywhere. It's out of our attention, but we forget that we only saved lives. The livelihood is gone, the crop is gone, their houses are gone, their toilet sanitation facilities are gone. They all need to be rebuilt. And because there's no story, no media, there's no attention to that part, and often that time those disasters get unnoticed, and it's very, very difficult for community to cope up or build back better or be normal.
I'm looking at Daniel. So are we doing a good enough job as humanitarians influencing the discussion on mitigation, or as you said, like the 1.5 degree goal? Sorry for any Swedish. Do you want to utmana, challenge us a bit, Anna? Where are we in those discussions, and do you think we as humanitarians are being doing a good enough job?
Yeah.
Anna.
Yeah,
I was just pointing back to
Yeah,
Victor,
okay.
as you said that's something we should do.
Well, if we look at on a country level, I mean, the world is still not on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. That is clear. And despite decades of scientific consensus identifying fossil fuels as the main driver of global warming, I mean, it took nearly 30 years of negotiations before the global community finally agreed to transition away from them. And that breakthrough came last year at last year's COP summit in Dubai. And while the agreement, yes, it could have been more ambitious to fully align with the science, but it's still a step in the right direction. But whether this truly marks the beginning of the end for the fossil fuel era, that it depends entirely on the actions that the countries take now. And like I said, financing here is key. But that is not only the challenge when it comes to mitigation. And many politicians in Europe, but not least here in Sweden, they are or have been concerned about, placing further financial burdens on households, for instance, through high fuel taxes. And unfortunately, that has resulted in either reductions or eliminations of climate policy instruments without really replacing them with new and effective alternatives. So yeah, and earlier this year we saw the farmer protests in Europe, and I think that likely pressured the European Commission into compromising their new climate targets. And also, if you look to the US, I mean, if Trump were to come back, he could potentially dismantle the Inflation Reduction Act, and he could also pull out of the Paris Agreement again. And this would, of course, send a terrible signal to the rest of the world. So yeah, if wealthier nations, if we fail to meet our climate commitments, then yeah, it just won't just exacerbate climate change, it would also erode the trust in the entire global negotiation process.
So if I read between the line, we
Yeah.
should perhaps talk a bit more about the humanitarian consequences that we face and meet in these discussions. Is that?
Yeah, that could be a good starting point, definitely. And yeah.
But Victor's also raising his hand.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there are two things that I'm struggling with where we need your help from this sector. So one, you mentioned, Ulrika, you mentioned attribution and attribution studies. We're able, whenever we see a big flood or whatever, nowadays we can say it's this more likely because of climate change, or 50% stronger, or much more frequent. What are you going to do with that information? Like, how are you going to act on it? How are you going to communicate it to people? How is that going to change the way you operate? That's one question. The other one, can we please have a sensible discussion about migration in society today? I think, to me, I'm a migrant myself, right? So we know migration, when done in a safe way, in a legal way, is a great adaptation strategy, because people create new homes somewhere else. They send money back. I mean, that kind of money is way bigger than overseas development assistance funds. Like, how do we have a sensible discussion about migration, and migration as an adaptation strategy that we can offer people in a safe way? I mean, please. I mean, it makes me really, really sad to see how that debate is totally missed. Like, even also like in the US debate, and I wrote about that. If you talk about Kamala Harris and her climate policy, where is climate migration in that agenda? Like, how do we tackle such an important issue?
And I'm also looking at the speakers in the next segment, because we're soon going to add the layer of conflict-affected countries and climate-affected countries. And I'm sure we're going to talk about the aspect of migration in the next conversation as well. Ranjan, I will give you the final word in this segment.
I think I will say that gone are the days when we were thinking whether there's a climate change or not. We are living in this time where we see the impact on day-to-day basis. I gave you example how it's impacting. I humbly request to, see how you all can support not only financial, but the research, the innovation. How could the developing countries or underdeveloped country can benefit from the research happening in the West, and how could that research can be transmitted to the countries where we are, so we can utilize it and save time rather than going through the learning curve. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for...